Hello, listeners. This is JP Elliott, and you're listening to the CHRO Mindset Podcast.
Hello, listeners. Welcome back to the season 2 of the CHRO Mindset Podcast. After an incredible first season, we are back with more dynamic conversations and actionable insights. Today, we have the pleasure of hosting JP Elliott, a forward-thinking HR leader and the visionary founder of Future of HR. Through the Next Generation HR Accelerator, JP has equipped HR leaders from top organizations like Verizon, Cardinal Health, and General Mills with essential skills in business acumen, strategic thinking, and communication. His super famous Future of HR podcast, boasting over 200K downloads across 53 countries, has become a trusted resource for HR professionals globally. Previously, JP has held leadership roles in renowned organizations like McAfee, JC Penney, and William Smartson, where he championed talent development, inclusion, and business growth. A sought-after consultant and a speaker, JP combines his rich experience and innovative approach to elevate HR's impact and reimagine its role in driving organizational success. JP, thanks a ton for taking out time to speak with us today, and welcome to the CHRO Mindset Podcast.
Thank you, Pulkat. It's great to see you and great to be on the CHRO Mindset Podcast.
Awesome. So let's get going. A little bit about this episode for our listeners. The future of work calls for HR leaders who can navigate culture, innovate, and meet workforce expectations. But how can we prepare the next generation for these challenges? In today's episode, we'll discuss essential skills around succession planning, AI's impact on HR, and bridging technical expertise with soft skills. We'll also explore overlooked practices in shaping future HR leaders. So let's get going. JP, I'm going to come to you with an icebreaker question first. After having such an illustrious career in HR, would love to know what inspired you to pursue a career in HR and what has been your most memorable learning moment so far?
Yeah, it's a great question. For me, I'm not sure it's really the career in HR that all of us really aspire to when we're younger or going to college. But my mom and my dad, I think, had a big influence. My mom was a marriage and family counselor. And so she was very in touch with, speaking about your emotions and your feelings and help me communicate and bring the softer skills to light, I think, growing up. And then my dad was an entrepreneur, had a PhD in economics, and, he taught me about business. And so I always kind of felt like I wanted to do something at the intersection of business and people, and kind of found HR a little bit by accident, like a lot of us do. I initially went to get my PhD in organizational psychology and really thought I'd be a consultant. And then I realized all the action was in HR. That's where all the fun was. That's where you actually got to do the work and really kind of have an impact on people, but still help the business. And so that's kind of the story of how I got into HR. And learning moment. Oh my gosh, so many learning moments through our career, right? I think that it's always hard to pick one, but I'm going to think back to early career. I worked at Yum Brands, which owns Taco Bell, Pizza Hut, KFC. I was working at Taco Bell, and I had an amazing manager there that I'm still friends with. And he gave me the feedback early in my career, because I was my first real job, that I made too many jokes, that I was always trying to be funny in meetings, and that I wasn't detailed oriented enough, and it was going to hold me back in my career. And I think the fact that he was able to give me such really truthful, candid feedback, it shaped a lot of things. It really helped me think differently about how I could improve, helped me to seek out more feedback. And yes, I got better at details and probably stopped making jokes in meetings, even though I love to make jokes like everyone does. So I got more serious, more focused, and I think it helped my career.
Great. Thank you for candidly sharing that. Now let's talk about the impact of HR, right? There are tons of theories around what it takes to become an effective HR. But in your opinion, what makes an HR leader not just effective, but transformational in today's dynamic workplace?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. We talk about, we think about these transformational HR leaders or leaders in general, but it really starts with the basics. frankly, and you have to master the basics first. And
Mm-hmm.
after having, like you as a podcast host, I've talked to over 100 thought leaders. I think we're on 122, 125 episode this week. I forget exactly because it's been so many. But after 100 interviews with CHROs and certain thought leaders, I've built what I call the what, who, how great HR leader framework. And the reason I did this is because I got this question all the time. JP, what have you learned after all these interviews? And I sat back and I started to think, well, what am I learning here? And it wasn't really about technology. It wasn't about certain techniques. What I was learning was the best HR leaders understood who they were as leaders. That's what I call the what. So the what is they understood what they stood for. They had a leadership philosophy that resonated with their values and gives them a quiet confidence to really make an impact in the business. The who part is who you identify as. All great HR leaders identify as business leaders first, HR leaders second. And the last is how you show up. And these leaders showed up in really 5 key ways. They're business focused, they're relationship builders, they're critical and strategic thinkers, they're impactful communicators, and they can translate business strategy to HR strategy that drives value and impact. And this is really, frankly, the foundation for all great HR leaders. And it's a similar model that you might see in other competencies. But I think what makes this different is that thinking about the what you stand for and who you identify as is the foundation. So you have to get better at all of these every day. And to be transformational, I think if you're great at all these areas and then you have a sense of purpose and you know what you're really trying to drive, that's where you start to see magic happen. But every one of us, every HR leader can get better at this. We don't have to be transformational. It's like comparing ourselves to Steve Jobs or some of these different, founders of companies that have done and create, accomplished amazing things. It's not a fair bar. The reality is many HR leaders, even if you aren't transformational or visionary, can have a huge impact in the organization. But we've got to get better at these basics. And you got to think about, the what, the who, and the how.
Right. So in your opinion, what's your take on how should organizations address the massive gaps that they see in current HR leadership pipelines?
Yeah, I mean, I think we do have a gap in our leadership pipeline, and it's really a self-inflicted wound. We don't invest enough in ourselves. As HR leaders and functions, we're thinking about how we help build out the sales function, how we help build out the operations, how we help build out finance. We rarely think about what's our development plan for our HR team. How are we going to, elevate our game and elevate our talent and upskill them so they're ready for bigger challenges. And it's not just teaching them HR skills. The biggest gap we have is around business acumen. We need to teach our young, early career, mid-career, frankly, even some senior HR leaders, but mostly, this early and mid-career HR leaders really need to understand how to become business leaders. What does it mean to be a business first leader? So that's not just business acumen, that's strategy, understand how operations, understanding the value chain, understanding financial acumen, P&L, and we don't lean into this enough, and we don't translate it in a way that makes sense. We say, well, you can go out on the internet, you can find this on YouTube, you can go read the P&L, but that doesn't help people translate it to understand why does the P&L matter? How do I understand how we can make a difference? Because that's really the biggest gap. And when HR leaders are really business focused and they have business acumen, they gain the credibility with their leaders and they have an opportunity to start to move upstream, if you will, get invited to meetings earlier and have an impact on the people strategy that really ultimately impacts the business strategy.
Great. That's a very key insight, right? I mean, it's if you look at it from a learning and development perspective, it's the HR, who are the custodian, but they get so immersed in managing the L&D of other functions, they rarely look at themselves in the mirror and see, how far they have come. Absolutely, Jim. So let's keep going. So let's say, you've just spoken about the fact that they need to upskill, reskill themselves, learn, unlearn, relearn, right? In your opinion, what role does succession planning play when it comes to building the next generation of HR leaders? How should, the topmost CHRO or the chief people officer look at, taking care of succession planning?
I think it's really important. And, the best organizations that I've seen that do this well is they're focused on moving people from the centers of excellence into HR business partner roles and back and forth, and even oftentimes into the business, whether that might be a more of an enablement function or a support function, or truly a business function. And so what you've got to be much more proactive about is really ask leadership for what? What HR talent are we building and for what purpose? And to really think about that. It's difficult for anyone to have all the experiences at one company to become a CHRO. That's why it takes 20 years. These aren't things that happen overnight. But you can be much more thoughtful to say, well, do we have a bench for our chief talent officer, our total rewards officer? Do we have one for our HR business partners? And be much more thoughtful about, well, how do we give them experiences that broaden their view of the business, broaden their view of HR, and prepare them to move from specialist to generalist and have a much bigger impact on the company. And so I think you've got to be really planful about that. When you think about CHRO succession planning, it's more challenging, frankly, because a lot of times, even though companies may have been developing successors, a new CEO comes in and they have decided to make a change. So I think, one of the things you look at the data around CHRO transitions and succession planning is that if a new CEO comes in, it's more likely than not a new CHRO will also be placed. That can be really challenging because people are looking for an outside perspective. But you can do your best to really prepare a successor by making sure they've had all these experiences, and then they start to get more exposure to the board, executive comp, things that are really higher level. And I think that's kind of in the, it's the last few inches or the last mile. If you think about delivery for someone delivering to a package to your house, it's that last few inches that you have to get to be a really successful CHROs. You've got to have executive experience, executive comp, and board experience. That's always the hardest part. But overall, we've just got to do a better job preparing people and moving them back and forth so they understand, appreciate, and have empathy for what everyone does in HR, no matter their role.
Great perspective. So we've spoken about the fact that HR is a function, or HRs need to up the ante when it comes to looking at their skill sets. And now with AI and next gen technology coming into the landscape, how should they look at it? I mean, how should they reshape their skills? Should they go back to the basics, the fundamentals, or should they take a leap of faith and straight away leverage AI to sort of take care of all the skills that they need to build? What's your take on this, JP?
Well, I think AI is going to reshape, every part of our organizations and probably every part of our culture and company or life as well. It truly is a transformational technology that has capability that we're just, really honestly just starting to see. So I think it's going to impact HR in a lot of ways. The first thing, though, when you think about technology like AI, automation will kill jobs, but it doesn't destroy work, right? So automation destroys jobs, but not work. So the work will shift and the work will change. The question will be, as HR leaders, are we prepared to understand how our work will change? And so there's really three scenarios. One is AI takes all of our jobs. This is probably unlikely in the next 5 years or more because they're taking away a task potentially. So I don't think that's going to happen. Number two is AI won't take your job, but someone using AI will take your job, right? And this is, what is probably pretty likely. And for HR leaders, you have to start to get more comfortable with AI. And I encourage all HR leaders to understand, not only experiment and play with AI, but understand a little more about the programming behind it, because generative AI is not like a typical programming language, and it is not used the same way. And why I say that is because if you're going to be designing and helping your organization to automate work, it's helpful to understand a little bit around the levers you have to pull to actually make those changes happen, right? So I would educate yourself on that piece so that you can help redesign work, because that's what's going to be happening a lot. And the third is, I think, AI will replace some of our tasks that we do today. I call this the washing dishes effect, that we all hope AI will wash the dishes for us and, we'll have more time to do other things. And I think that primarily will happen. And the work I have seen around, I think, Boston, BCG, kind consulting group who talked about, between 20 to 30% of tasks, really 10 to 30% of tasks in HR could be outsourced or automated through AI. And I think that's probably really true. Maybe it's going to be higher. Maybe it's a little lower in some functions. But here's the net. AI will start to replace or help you automate different tasks. The question then is, how do you create value? And for HR leaders, we have to ask ourselves, how are we creating value in today? And how will we create value tomorrow if AI changes how our job is changing? So we have to think with the organization, think with business leaders, and think differently. So if your main function, your main added value is you own a process, and you own that process and you make sure that process runs really smooth, and that process has now been outsourced by AI, your value is going to shift. And so instead of being scared by that, you've got to now rethink, well, how can I add value differently in the organization in higher and more useful ways? And so I think that's what's really going to be coming for all of us, is this idea of what is value and how do I create value with this automation that's going to probably come from AI in many areas.
Great. I love that statement that you made. Automation kills jobs, but does not destroy work. I think it's very profound, very simply put in very simple words. And of course, I think HRs have to start looking at value creation. There's no point in running away from the fear of AI. I think it's time they sort of embrace it and look at the positive side of how it can help them become a better HR person. Okay, let's keep going. We were talking about skills, right? So on one side of the house, you have all the technical HR skills that they need to take care of. And then on the other side, we're talking about leadership soft skills, right? And as one grows up the ladder, I think, the proportion of leadership skills versus technical skills does increase a little bit, right? So what's your take on how should they strike a balance between these two, shores?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think you have to do both, right? It's not either or. You will not succeed unless you've done both. I agree with you. As you move up into your career and more senior roles, you have to rely more on your leadership skills. You'll move from a specialist where it was your technical skills into a generalist role where now you're leading a function, you're leading a broader team. You may have people on your team who know a lot more about a subject than you do, and you've got to now move from this expert to a generalist mindset. And that means it's more about leadership. It's about asking questions. It's about framing the business problems. All that's really critical. The thing is, you just don't get those overnight. You don't become a great leader overnight. So you have to start to develop that even when you're earlier in your career, even when you're a specialist, even when you maybe are an analyst role. What does that mean? Well, how do you start to say, I want to lead this project? I want to lead this meeting. Start to practice these skill sets. And frankly, what might feel like high stakes environment, but it's not really high stakes yet because you're still early in your career. You can make some mistakes, be around other leaders and see how they operate. So you have to do both. Now, technically, to get to that level of leadership, you have to be good. So for your craft, whether that is total rewards or it's talent management or an HR business partner or HR operations or diversity inclusion or learning development, there are skill sets, there's knowledge, there are technical things you need to learn. You should map that out. You should make a list of all the skills you believe you need to have to get to the level you want to get to, and do the same on the leadership side. And then just take a real assessment of how are you doing, right? And then start to work on those both, because you just it doesn't happen overnight, but you'll have to have both when you get there. Now, later in your career, you can sort of forget a little bit about the technical skills. You don't have to know everything that's happening. You'll have to rely more on that leadership piece, but you don't get to leadership unless you actually are a high performer to begin with. So you've just got to do both.
Agree. Great perspective there again, JP. Let's now talk about some of the overlooked practices that organizations should develop or adopt, as they create that lineup of some awesome HR leaders, right? I mean, every organization has their own way of incubating and fostering an environment where all these HR leaders can grow. But any overlooked practices in your opinion, that they should adopt that they might be completely ignoring?
Well, I mean, I think if you go back to the fact that most HR organizations aren't staffed or budgeted to make big investments in their own team, and that's understandable. I understand that completely. So you've got to make some real choices, and a lot of organizations there's two choices they have to make. How much do we differentiate on our best people and really invest in them? And I, number one, always think experience is the first place to go. So it's not so much overlooked, but are you moving people around? Are you creating cross-functional projects and pulling people into it and giving them an opportunity to lead? I mean, that is number one. Number two, people, I think mentoring inside the company is overlooked. We don't do that enough in terms of within your own HR function or even sometimes outside the HR function. So we leave that a lot to our own really team members to figure that out. The third piece I think is really critical that we just could make more investments in, and that is external programs. And that's one reason why I created the Next Gen HR Accelerator. So that is self-serving, I understand, but there are some really good programs, whether that's going to a conference, but being very selective and really making sure there's some outcomes coming from that. I mean, I think that can be helpful. Again, I think HR teams don't have the time and they haven't been able to put the focus on how they develop some of this content. Some large organizations have, of course, but most smaller organizations really struggle with this. So leverage external opportunities and programs. Then I would also say peer networks is critical. I think that, this is something that we'll see more of, hopefully, but thinking about helping HR leaders to develop their own peer coaching, peer networks is really important, especially external networks. And I hear that in my own programs that people will come in from different companies. And one of the things they like best about the program is the fact they got to meet other HR leaders from a different company. And they said, oh, wow, we have the same challenges. We have the same problems. This isn't just me that's struggling with this. And now they've got someone else they can call. So I think that's really important. Hopefully we'll see more of that in 2025.
Okay, cool. Your advice for people, HR professionals who are aspiring to step into leadership roles? I know it's everyone might have their own trajectory, their own path, but would still want to learn from you. In your experience, you have been coaching so many folks out there. What's your advice for folks you want to get into a CHRO or a CPO role?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And so two things. First, you need to develop rare and valuable skills. And by say rare and valuable, that means that, you've got to look at, for your discipline, your area, what are the most critical skills, the most valuable skills you can learn that will help propel your career faster. Because when you are hired to do a job, you're hired to solve a problem. And that's how leaders are looking at you. They're like, well, this leader, this HR leader, can they help me drive revenue growth? Have they redesigned comp plans? Have they, what does those mean? So if you want to have an amazing career, develop rare and valuable skills. Rare skills, frankly, can be speaking skills. It can be amazing at being in project management. It could be executive comp or around talent. The valuable skills are the leadership pieces. So really being thoughtful about those two things is critical if you want to have a differentiated career, right? Because the goal is to stand out. It's to be different and have people to think about you and know you have a skill set that others don't. And frankly, no one can duplicate you. So each of us have an opportunity to be rare and valuable in our own way. Second, it goes back to the basics, frankly. And this is, you have to be a high performer. It doesn't matter what anyone says to you. You are not going to have an amazing career if you are not over delivering and delivering expectations or more. And this does mean there's some trade-offs in life. You may have to work more hours than somebody else. I mean, that is just the facts of life, right? It's like, I would love to be a shortcut, but if you only put 40 hours in a week and someone else who's in your team who might be considered a peer is putting 50 or 55 hours in a week, well, over a year, that is a lot of time, which probably means they have an opportunity to get more work done. And so I'm not saying don't have work-life balance. That's your choice. But a lot of high performers are making the choice to invest more in the business to do that. The last piece, besides thinking about the great HR leader framework, I think that is really the fundamental. And I'd say read the HR leader's blueprint will help you as well, is just know that you have to do the job before you get the job. I think about people when you're in a company, a lot of people think, well, it's just my manager has to see my work. It's not true. Your manager, their boss, and their peers almost always all have to agree that you're ready for promotion. So this isn't just pleasing one person. This is building a brand internally so that you have that group of leaders that say, oh my gosh, wow, this person is doing so much great work. They're already doing the job. Of course, they're ready for promotion. If you do all those things, you're going to go pretty far and fast in your career. And I think you'll have no problem at all. But it isn't easy all the time. And we all have to continue to work through these things. Everyone's got their own recipe for it. But those are really the key factors. Put the work in, be strategic about building that network, do the job before the job, and really apply that great HR leader framework.
Great. Love that framework, JP. Thank you for that. Let's now segue into our rapid fire section. So let's get going. One HR trend you think will dominate in the next 5 years?
Well, of course, AI is going to dominate everything, but I'm going to say digital coaching. I think digital coaching using AI is going to be a big trend in 2025. And I think that'll continue the next 5 years because I think there's a lot of potential for digital coaching, not only for really helping be people for development, but for people managers in difficult situations. I just think that's going to be really something that just continues to really take a lot of time and attention from HR leaders.
Cool. A book every HR leader should read?
There's so many good books. I love reading books, but I'm gonna go with The Leadership Pipeline by Stephen Drotter, Kent Johansson. They just republished this and updated it. It's a classic. But if you haven't read this book, it's going to help you understand how to develop leaders. And I think it'll shift your mindset on what that really is and why that matters.
Okay. Biggest HR myth you want to debunk? There's so many of them.
So many of them. But, for me, it's generational differences. It's fun to talk about generational differences because it's easy for us to see or think about. But the reality is the research on generational differences is pretty weak. It's really more about your life stage. And more importantly, I just don't know any company that ever has really been able to design all their HR processes or business processes to match a generational difference, right? So I think it's an overused term. Technology has driven a lot of the differences, frankly, more than anything else. And I did have a great, leader on my podcast, Gene Twangy from San Diego State, who's a generational differences expert that went really deep in this area. But it's just one thing we talk a lot about in HR, and I just don't think it's that useful. And so for me, it's one thing I wish we could stop talking about.
Okay. One piece of advice you would give to your younger self?
Oh, just one piece? I mean, there's so many things I'd probably say. For me, I think it's just be more patient. Be more patient. Not with the results that I expected, but with the progress and the journey. I think early in my career, I was a little impatient at times and was highly ambitious and wanted things faster. But maybe that's just youth.
Yes, very true. Most rewarding aspect of HR leadership?
Yeah, I think the entire profession is so noble. I think what we get to do in terms of impacting people's lives, impacting people's careers, helping people in really difficult situations or times, and it's just incredible. So for me, that is probably the most rewarding aspect, is that we all have an opportunity to touch so many people in so many different ways. And sometimes it's very direct and sometimes indirect. And I think that is what makes HR so powerful.
Absolutely, bang on. I totally agree with you. One thing about HR that surprises people outside the field?
Well, I think, people have a stereotype of HR people because of movies and TVs and maybe the companies they work with. The reality is HR people are strategic, we're business focused, and we are really trying to measure impact on the results and drive business results. And I think that surprises people when they meet HR leaders that are actually that business focused, right? And it depends on the company you come from. But I know as a profession, every HR leader I've ever met, they do want the business to be successful. They want to be strategic. They want to have that impact. They're not there to be a stereotype, pushing paper and be administrative.
Great. With that, I come to the last question of this awesome conversation, JP. Do you believe HR leaders should always align with business goals, even if it comes at the cost of employee satisfaction?
Yeah, I think, this is interesting 'cause I don't think it's zero sum, but the reality is our job in HR is to ensure the organization has the talent and capabilities to win. When the business wins, the team members win, right? The people win in the organization. So there are going to be times when things are not going to appear the right decision to everyone in the company, but you have to do the right thing for the business. And so for me, I think we've had to put the business first. Our job is to make sure the organization wins. And if the organization's winning, then there's more opportunity and growth for career and everything else. So that's how I think about it.
Great. I know it's a very tight rope to walk on, but you brought out a very significant balance that HRs have to strike. So thank you for that. Absolute honor to have you join us on the CHRO Mindset Podcast, JP. Your quote around automation kills jobs, but it does not destroy work was an absolute awesome one, right? Something that I'm going to certainly quote at a lot of places wherever I go and speak.
Thank you, Pulkit. It's very, very kind. It was really exciting to be on the podcast. And thanks for listening to the Future of HR podcast as well. To reach out to me, you can find me on LinkedIn at JP Elliott, PhD. You also can find me at futureofhr.com. That's probably the best place to find more information about the podcast and myself, and also get the HR Leaders Blueprint. But Phuket, this was a real honor, really fun to talk with you, and appreciate all you're doing.
Awesome. Thanks, JP. Thanks again to all our listeners. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the CHRO Mindset Podcast. I had a lot of takeaways from this conversation today. I'm sure that would be the case for you as well. Don't forget to subscribe, share, and leave us a review if you enjoyed the episode. See you into the next episode. Thanks again for your time today.